During the recent years, especially the last months, we've really witnessed an unprecedented convergence of crises. Political tensions, wars, economical instability, health pandemic also a few years ago, and the growing, of course, impact of the climate change, which is very important for the world and this planet. Countries, nations, institutions, individuals are facing a challenge that tests their resilience, our resilience actually, and vision for the future. However, I like this however, history often shows that chaos can also be a breeding ground for innovation, transformation, and new opportunities. Today, in this, of course, session, we will explore how the current global turmoil might not only be a source of concern for all of us, but a catalyst for a positive change. Thank you for being with us. I will start with you, Your Excellency, Dr. Shashi. How do you define the current state of the global turmoil?
You know, we had a period when the Cold War bipolarity gave way to two overlapping and by and large seen as positive developments. Globalization, spreading around the world, knitting us together economically, technologically, and so on. And of course, from 1990, with the end of the Cold War, the unipolar moment when the US seemed to be in really a position of dominance technologically, economically, militarily, politically. Now, this has suddenly been challenged with four developments I'd like to identify briefly. The first is the backlash against globalization, which gathered pace. It had two components, economic and cultural. The economic backlash was people in the developed countries saying, why are we voting for governments that are sending our jobs off to China and India and places like that? And I think there was a cultural backlash as well against the cosmopolitanism that came with globalization. Davos man flitting around the globe, the migrants who are coming into different countries. And that cultural backlash has been described very effectively as a clash between the somewheres and the anywheres. Anywheres being people like us here who can speak anywhere in the world, and the somewheres being those anchored in one country, one religion, one language, one place. So that's the first major trend. The second, I would say, was the end of the peaceful rise of China, which took place during that period of globalization. China becoming more assertive, more effective, and challenging the US dominance in all these areas, political, economic, technological, military. Third, and this is where Carl, I'm sure, will have a lot more to say, is Europe. Europe, I remember Carl telling me a few years ago, oh, there's an arc of crisis from the Nile to the Indus. Well, it's gone well beyond the Nile now. Ukraine has dragged Europe into this arc of crisis. And I think there is a certain European ambivalence as well about where they fit into all of this. Ambivalence over Ukraine, ambivalence over China, and of course Russia right on their doorstep. And the fourth and final trend I see is the emergence of new theaters of international cooperation in response to all this. You've got the talk about the Indo-Pacific for the first time. We've got the references to the rise of the rest, which is now being talked about as the global South, which is seeking to be both non-West without being anti-West, and expressing its ambitions in different ways. I mean, it's a cliche that in world affairs, you're either at the table or on the menu. And if you don't want to be on the menu, you have to find ways of expressing your opportunities at the high table. So they're also trying to do this. And this is manifesting itself in multiple ways we can talk about: plurilateral arrangements, new groupings, and
amazing
so on.
Overview for the situation that could have led to this turbulence. So backlash, globalization, cultural and economical, China, Europe, and the new emerging countries. Your Excellency, Dr. Bildt, how do you see, from your point of view, we saw the East point of view, let's see the West point of view. What do you see the primary causes of the global actual turbulences and crisis?
Well, I think what is the characteristics of this age or time, or whatever we prefer to call it, is that on the one side, we have dangerously rising geopolitical tensions. And I would say more wars and more risks of wars than we've been faced with for decades. That's one side of it. The other side is the rise of global challenges.
Yeah.
Be that climate, be that global health, be that the need to regulate artificial intelligence and all of those things that are happening. But those have a situation where geopolitical tensions makes it more difficult to handle the global challenges. We see the United Nations Security Council being paralyzed, be that by Gaza or be that by Ukraine, and unable to fulfill the function that it should function. At the same time, we see that there are challenges that can only be met by everyone working together. We did survive COVID, but we know that new challenges are on the horizon. We are dealing with an Mpox challenge, which is in Africa at the moment, but could be somewhere else tomorrow, and there could be something else around the corner. And that is the dilemma of our age. I am profoundly worried I was coming directly from Kiev to here, had a sleepless night because of Russian air raids, and then the train journeys and all of that. I'm profoundly worried by the rising risks of war in East Asia and by the risk of war proliferating also in Africa, which is, of course, the immediate neighborhood of Europe.
Okay, we don't wish it, but probably there are coming wars in East Asia and probably in Africa in a few, of course, spots. Dr. Shashi, here you mentioned China. As we witnessed shifting power dynamic during the last decade, so the last 20 years between East and West, what impact do you believe this rivalry in having on global stability and cooperation? And you mentioned it, it's mainly China and America.
Well, I mean, China is definitely now emerging as a new hegemon, a new significant, whether you want to call it superpower or whatever, a challenge to the US. At the same time, the Chinese and the Americans have levels of cooperation and interdependence that never existed during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. You've got more Chinese investments in US Treasury bonds. You've got more American investments in the Chinese economy. You've got Chinese students in America. You've got American tourists in China. All of these things didn't happen during the Cold War. So it's not quite the same thing, but there are a number of concerns. China's become much more assertive on its borders, maritime as well as land with us in India, where we've had a very unpleasant incident that ended 44 years of a peaceful coexistence on our otherwise disputed frontier. We've had incidents in the South China Sea with the Japanese, with the Philippines, with Vietnam. So it's a different China from what we had got used to in the earlier days.
And the high-tech, powerful advance
They're advancing
of China.
remarkably in high-tech. Solar, they're world leaders. 5G, they're perhaps ahead of America. We're not entirely sure, but there's an
5G,
awful lot of progress happening. So technologically, they're doing well. Militarily, they've almost caught up. The Chinese Navy is almost as well equipped as the American Navy now. They've got more planes, more soldiers, obviously. And as far as the economy is concerned, they have already supplanted the US as a manufacturing power, as an industrial power, and they will overtake the US economy.
And they are eating this, between the first powerful country, that is the US, they are coming second economically, and they are grabbing in the scales to more and more be closer to America, which they don't like it. So how did this rivalry affected the rest of the world, Dr. Bill?
Well, it of course affects every part of the world. It affects the very nature of global cooperation, where we have the dominant powers so far fearing that it might be replaced. I think that is a somewhat exaggerated fear, but anyhow, the fear is there, and is driving a lot of U.S. politics. I mean, if we go to Washington these days, it's all about China, China, China,
exactly.
And in addition to that, an element of China, if I'm exaggerating only slightly. And that is the fear of what I sometimes call the 1870 moment, which was when Britain lost its position as the leading economy in the world to the United States. Then it took quite some time for the United States to emerge as a political and military power. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, the Americans fear that will happen to them. I think it's exaggerated.
They are afraid to happen to them via China.
Well, they fear the rise of Chinese power.
Okay.
And the problem is, of course, that I agree with everything Shashi said about China, but it should also be said that the Chinese do have a point. And the Indians do have a point that we live in, to a large extent, a 1945 world. And the world looks differently. And the Chinese are saying, we want to have a voice. And the Indians are saying, we want to have a voice. And others say, we want to have a voice. And then, of course, how do we gradually adjust the structures of global cooperation without sort of disrupting it, without causing conflict, but balancing it in a better way, in accordance with the new global realities. That
and Europe is ambivalent, isn't it?
Sorry?
Europe is ambivalent about this whole thing.
Sweden is in favor, but no, Europe is, of course, ambivalent. I remember when I was foreign minister in the European Union, I suggested in one of our foreign ministers' meeting that we should have one EU seat in the Security Council.
Yes.
That didn't make me popular in Paris and London, I can tell you.
Which is not giving. Because you spoke about the EU, I want to start talking within this platform of so many crises and wars. What are the alliances? We talk about alliances EU. We have BRICS that was joined by UAE, for example, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example. We have NATO is an alliance. We have ASEAN is an alliance. I'm talking about economic blocks and, of course, military blocks as well. What are they from all those
there's a proliferation of such groupings. The Americans, of course, still rely heavily on NATO. And what's interesting is the Russian invasion of Ukraine has resulted in Sweden, Sweden and Finland joining NATO, which was never on the cards until the Russians invaded Ukraine.
But it's okay to say for now, because if Trump is coming, NATO will not be really in a good position?
Well, we'll have to see. But it's not just NATO. What Americans are doing is creating smaller groupings, mini-lateral groupings everywhere. So where countries are not willing to be allies in the formal sense, like India, they've created partnerships. There's a group called the Quad, which is US, Japan, Australia, India.
True.
There's another group called the Squad, where it's the Philippines instead of India. There's the Australia, US, UK, or AUKUS, which is now a military alliance because all three are formally allied. And you've got all of these different things happening to try and shore up the effort of the Americans to match economic decoupling from China on the one hand with a geopolitical and military containment of China. So that's interesting. China, on the other hand, has no allies. Show me a Chinese ally. There isn't an ally. They have dependencies.
How?
They have countries that are dependent on them. And with America...
They are soft power in Africa, Dr. Shashi. How is that? They have a lot of African countries. They are allies because they build, they invest.
They're not alliances, they're dependencies. So they are given an awful amount of aid, and those countries are suitably grateful. But the fact is, these are not countries that they can use in a geopolitical conflict or a standoff. Linked to that is the fact of the whole big question mark over the Chinese-Russian partnership. You remember just before the Ukraine war started, Mr. Putin visited Beijing and there was this announcement of a no-limits partnership. Well, some of the limits are already becoming apparent in terms of how far the Chinese can go to support the Russians. Now, on top of that, you've got this question of the fact that Russia, on the one hand, is more and more dependent on China, economically, trade, in terms of sanctions, military, and so on. But at the same time, they have relations with countries that are not so happy with China, including India and Vietnam. So it's all very complicated. It's not a clear picture.
I want to understand this point. America, with you. America is creating all those blocks, powering also some other blocks that we see in the world, and their only point is to challenge China?
Well, the Chinese are seen by the Americans, as Carl also said, as a very, very fundamental threat to the Americans. Unlike, by the way, 1870, Carl, the Chinese have got off to a much earlier start when it comes to strengthening their military and their technological role. The Americans had barely recovered from their civil war in 1870, so they took much longer. Today, the Chinese are in a position to challenge the Americans, even militarily, in 10 years' time.
Dr. Billett. So how those blocks, they are very important, they're a very important component of the actual world today and the scene. How can they be part of the challenge to resolve, of course, the issues of the actual crisis in the world?
Well, first, I think, which I indicated earlier, that I think the American fear of the Chinese is somewhat exaggerated. It is certainly true that the Chinese are investing far more in the military than they used to do. But that has to do also with the strength of the Chinese economy. But in terms of military expenditure, US is nearly as much as the rest of the world taken together, and has a superiority in space and in nuclear and things like that is unrivaled. I mean, the Russians do have nuclear weapons, but that's the only thing they have, apart from the seat in the Security Council. The Chinese are developing powers, but they are far from, I mean, in decades until there could be a global military power of the size of the United States. It's simply not in the cards. They're regionally extremely important. And that does challenge the entire security structure of East Asia. And that is, of course, the fear that we will get a conflict in East Asia. I think it should be one of the main aims of global diplomacy to prevent that from happening by managing this particular cooperation. Then you are right to say that we have all of these different structures. I mean, all this alphabet soup of meetings that is happening all over the world. Some of them are fairly loose. Some of them might be transitory. Some of them might become something. The European Union is, of course, fairly unique in that it is a very deep integration of our economies and societies. And the big jump that we will take in the next decades or half decades is to go further east, in the sense that our fear is, of course, that, and the aggression against Ukraine is part of that, either Russia exports its instability towards the west of Europe, or we export our stability to the east. And enlargement with Ukraine is going to be one of the major challenges of European integration. We've lost UK, but we'll gain Ukraine.
Yeah, but I will ask the question in a different way. Why? Because all your answer are giving from both of you is like those alliances and blocs are to challenge and face one pole that is like China. My question now, do you see an opportunity for cooperation between those alliances to be part of the conflict resolutions in many parts of the world?
Well, for the sake of the world, I hope so, because obviously we're not sitting here saying we're all doomed into an inevitable conflict. But those opportunities would require some very, very serious and imaginative rethinking, both of global structures, which frankly, the United Nations was created after 2 world wars, a Holocaust, Hiroshima. You're not going to get that kind, God willing, we're not going to get that kind of crisis. So we need, even in times of relative peace and calm, to find the global imagination, to be able to redesign global systems, accommodate different voices, give the global south more of a voice, give the Chinese a place that is respectable without allowing them to dominate, give countries like India, Africa, and others their own place of honor. All of that is one thing that needs to be done. Secondly, we need to move away from the risk of greater bipolarity. We need to go, for example, away from this language of containment, which is very rife in Washington even today, into something more like constraining rather than containing, limiting how much damage any one country can do to its neighbors and others. As Carl said, perhaps China's ambitions are not yet global, but certainly in the region they are a hegemon in the making, and that should be constrained to some degree. And maybe instead of decoupling, we should be talking about multiplying our relationships economically as well as politically, rather than actually ending any relationships. But this will require multiple efforts by various countries across the world.
Do you think to get to that point as well, we need to somehow make a better effort to change the work of organizations such as the UN Security Council? You mentioned the EU is not representing, it's representing with, for example, France is there, but it's not represented EU. Africa is not represented. South America is not represented as well. Do you think because we are living in paralyzed now institutions, always follow it before any solution, there's a veto from somewhere, and there are no solution actually. Do you think the organization is time for them also to face the reality that it's time to change?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer to that question is, of course, yes. But then follows the question, how?
How, exactly.
And then we get stuck. There will be in the next few days, as a matter of fact, it's called Summit of the Future that the Secretary General has called, to address exactly that issue. How can we make the United Nations relevant again when it comes to the major global challenges? And I think we should keep expectations fairly low. Hopefully something comes out of it, perhaps in the digital domain, perhaps in some other domain, but we are in a period of rising tensions. And we have also the prospect of a change in the United States, where we might get an administration that will contribute to the further fracturing of the entire global system. Because if you look at what Mr. Trump is saying, forget about the NATO and more European security-related issues, if we fracture the entire global trading system, that's going to have profound, not only economic, but also political consequences, and will impact also our possibilities of handling climate change, pandemics, whatever. So we are in a holding pattern, you might say.
Until the upcoming election as well.
Absolutely.
Despite all this, I know we painted a very dark situation or the dark image of the world, but it is the reality. Despite that, history taught us and showed us in period of chaos, we can have, and it can lead us to some innovative solution and positive change. Great Depression, it was led by a lot of development after that. World War II, United Nations and Security Council, and now they need some changes. 70s energy crisis, it led to what we have now at sustainability in energy and the renewable energy. What can this lead us?
Well, I'm really worried about precisely those factors because as Carl rightly said, we might get a president in the United States who is already campaigning on openly talking about raising tariff barriers.
Yes.
20% on various goods, 40
China
for some
especially.
countries, 60 against China.
Yeah.
Now, this is a stark reminder of what happened in the 1930s when various American tariffs plunged the world into depression. On top of that, you're also seeing a reversal, a deglobalization, as it were, of many of the trends we were celebrating between 1980 and 2010. Even in Europe, which is the poster child for globalization, what happened last week? The Germans suddenly decided to introduce border controls even within the Schengen countries. We saw this also during COVID, when the Italians got the first cases in Europe. What did the rest of Europe do? What happened to their vaunted solidarity? They closed the borders. They didn't. They closed the borders and wouldn't let anything into Italy.
It was protectionism all over.
So suddenly you're seeing a reassertion of national interest, sovereignty, selfishness, and so on in very many countries, not just in the new sort of countries of the developing world, but everywhere else. And that could be calamitous. You're quite right that if countries start just saying, it's for ourselves, nothing else. COVID already showed us. The rich countries stacked up on vaccines, which they're now throwing away because the vaccines are expiring. And how many vaccines went to Africa? How many vaccines went to the poorer countries?
Whatever it came into Africa, went to Africa, it went very late.
Very small percent.
And even India stopped its exports.
No, India did export. No, that's not bad. Briefly, but India did continue to export much more than anyone else.
Yeah, I remember from the beginning
they did. We didn't end up with 4 times the supplies our people needed as some European
that's interesting,
countries.
Because in terms of crisis, the barriers start building up again. So tell us, do you see any light of optimism? What can come out of this, Dr. Bill?
First,
yes.
I think we both identify that one of the major risks is the fragmentation of the global economy, be that trade or otherwise. There have been different studies in the last year by IMF and the World Trade Organization saying that if we do full-scale fragmentation of a global trading system, we have a loss of up to 7% of global GDP. That's going to be disastrous for a large part of the world, completely disastrous for a large part of the world. Now, what are then the hopes? I would say the hope is probably in science and technology. The fact that there are so many opportunities opening up, but also that we are looking at the challenges of AI or synthetic biology, and scientists are working together to see how we can manage this. So we have sort of a globalization of scientific knowledge and of technological opportunities that might drive politics into a slightly more constructive phase, hopefully.
Interesting, because that was my following question, actually. Please, if you have a comment, please go ahead.
I'd like to think Carl might be right. I hope he is right. But my big worry is, are we forgetting the human beings in all our excitement about technology?
But for example, technology was built for the human beings.
If technology helps human beings but deprives the others of many human beings of jobs, how are they going to live? How can they afford the technology if they don't have any employment? If more and more technology deprives more and more people of work opportunities. We're seeing this happening already in some places. So I would like to have a more human-centered development of technology.
In the middle of this, what kind of leadership do you believe is necessary today to go through all this turmoil?
Well, very clearly you need a more cosmopolitan, more inclusive, more global-minded leadership that takes into account the realities elsewhere before we start completely retreating behind our own barriers. We don't want the somewheres to completely triumph over the anywheres. We'd like people to be anchored in their cultures while open to the rest of the world. And I think we also need a leadership that is occasionally willing to think beyond immediate self-interest. Yeah. Sometimes the sake of our common humanity, as the pandemic taught us, is more important.
And the climate change as well, the pandemic. I will end with you with the same question, actually, and I will start with you, Your Excellency. As we look with the future, how do you envision the global order will be ongoing for the future? How do you see it, the global order?
Well, I think the number one thing is to prevent the global disorders from getting worse. That will, sorry to say, that will have to be the immediate priority. Yeah. But the risks are there in Europe. They are very profound. If we can't stop this particular war and stop the aggression, the risks in Asia, in East Asia, are also even graver, you might add.
Yeah.
And take Africa from Somalia to Senegal. There's nothing. Sudan was mentioned. It looks very, very bleak with profound implications for global security. So if we manage to stop the disorder from spreading, then we can start to pick up the pieces and go back to building a global structure of cooperation centered on the challenges that are there, climate and health and technology, where interests are the same, irrespectively of all of the other challenges that we have and disorders.
Last answer with you.
I don't agree. I mean, I don't disagree at all with Carl in any of this. I just, I'm not sure right now that we have enough of the world's leaders committed to such a far-seeing vision. I wish Carl was still in charge of his country, be one voice from this direction.
Or Shashi.
But the truth is precisely that we need to get there, and I think he and I are on the same page on this. But to get there, we do need to take steps that right now we are not seeing enough countries taking. And that's what a forum like this, I hope, reminds us of the great need to talk to each other and cooperate very much.
This is why we are here. Hopefully, something good will come out of this forum, definitely, with all your bright mind. Thank you so much, Your Excellency.
Thank you,
Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, former Under-Secretary General at the United States, and Your Excellency, Dr. Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister of Sweden. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you so much.